We are awaiting a rally in Louisiana where President-elect Trump is back on the trail, hoping to put one more Republican in the U.S. Senate. Welcome to the second hour of Happening Now on this Friday. I'm John Scott.
Yay, Friday. I'm Heather Childers in for Jenna Lee. Great to be here.
Good to have you here.
And with everyone at home as well. Well, Mr. Trump is appearing with John Kennedy, and he is the Republican candidate for the Senate. He's in a runoff tomorrow against Democrat Foster Campbell. It is the Democrats' last chance to pick up a Senate seat. Meanwhile, House Speaker Paul Ryan making a trip through the revolving door of Trump Tower for a private meeting with the president-elect.
But perhaps the biggest missing piece of the cabinet puzzle is Secretary of State, with sources telling Fox one candidate is gaining favor. Peter Doocy live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Mr. Trump continues his victory tour later tonight. Peter.
John, but the president-elect's first high-profile meeting of the day was that sit-down with the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. The two of them are obviously going to work together a lot in Washington, D.C. starting next month, but they met in Midtown Manhattan today to start to map out a game plan.
Very exciting meeting. I really enjoyed coming up here and meeting with the president-elect. We had a great meeting to talk about our transition. We're very excited about getting to work and hitting the ground running in 2017 to put this country back on track. Thanks, guys.
And there has been a twist in the Secretary of State sweepstakes. Our colleague Jennifer Griffin spoke to a source close with President-elect Trump and reports back that ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson really impressed Mr. Trump with stories of doing business in 50 countries, so his stock is on the rise. Mitt Romney, though, his standing has fallen as his harsh criticism of Trump from the primaries is now being revisited, and Rudy Giuliani, we're told, is now in a weaker position as well, apparently because he talked so much to the press about wanting to be the top diplomat. Last night in Des Moines, Mr. Trump defended his cabinet picks so far amid some criticism that there have been too many billionaires given top jobs. He says that he wants people who made a fortune on their own because he thinks they're going to come aboard and make a fortune for the country now. And this morning, his top advisor, Kellyanne Conway, brushed aside some criticism that he's putting too many generals in the cabinet room as well.
I say that this is such a refreshing departure from rewarding donors or your personal friends with cabinet positions as you're forming your government. I mean, generals are serious people, Steve. They are folks who have proven themselves literally on the battlefield or figuratively with their distinguished service in the military or on behalf of our nation. And I keep reading that in places as if there's some kind of quota for the number of tough-minded, accomplished people.
So we are just a little ways away from seeing the president-elect at that Get Out the Vote rally down in Louisiana. And then this evening he will be here in Grand Rapids where it is snowing for a thank you victory rally where he will be joined by his pick to be the education secretary and Michigan native Betsy DeVos. John?
All right, Peter Doocy will be watching. Thanks very much. So as we wait to see who emerges to be Mr. Trump's pick for Secretary of State, what do his cabinet choices tell us about the next president of the United States? Jonathan Swain is national political reporter for The Hill. Jamie Weinstein is senior writer for The Daily Caller and host of a podcast, The Jamie Weinstein Show. Welcome to both of you. So as you size it up, Jamie, what do you see? What do these cabinet choices tell us about the next president?
Well, they tell us a few things. He obviously likes people that are very accomplished, generals, top business executives who made lots of money. He also seems to like, as he's mentioned before, people that look the part. That's why Mitt Romney, in part, is under consideration. Not only is he knowledgeable, but as people say, he's straight out of central casting. I think those are quotes that have been attributed to Donald Trump. He looks the part of Secretary of State. But what is interesting is that I think we learned a couple things that are surprising to some degree. A lot of people projected that he would only looking for those who are loyal to him, those who helped him out. But the fact that he's even looking at Mitt Romney suggests that he's open to the idea of those who weren't as supportive of him. He's picked candidates that don't necessarily share his worldview. His talk on immigration was very tough on the trail. His pick for Labor Secretary yesterday, Mr. Puzder, is certainly a guy who doesn't share his views on immigration, at least as expressed on the trail. He is more closely to Jeb Bush's immigration proposals. So he's open to those who may not necessarily agree with him, which is not a reputation that he cultivates elevated. People thought that he'd only be looking for those who are like him, and that's not the case so far.
Jonathan Swan, I've been reading your name all day and inserting an extra I in it, and I apologize for that. So you have some thoughts, though, about some of the, former opponents that he's been bringing in to audition, if you will, for his cabinet.
Yeah, look, the main thing that I think we need to bear in mind here, and you talk to anyone around Donald Trump, and I'm sure he would admit this himself, is he understands stagecraft. There is probably no person we've seen on the public sphere, maybe Ronald Reagan, maybe JFK, who understand television and how to create images. And some of these scenes that we're seeing through Trump Tower are really to project an image that Donald Trump wants, which is, he gets Al Gore to come through, and that sort of shows the left that maybe he's not so scary after all. Maybe he's willing to, reach out on that side. But I think you need to separate that from the substance of the people that he's appointing. And yes, Nikki Haley was an opponent, but I haven't really seen a whole lot of appointments made to people who were disloyal to Donald Trump.
But at the same time, he is putting people in his cabinet, Jamie, who have disagreed with him quite publicly.
Yeah.
Kathy McMorris Rodgers is said to be on the short list to be Secretary of Interior, and she was very tough on him, even though she's a fellow Republican, during the campaign.
Exactly. And again, look at the Labor Secretary, who wasn't necessarily tough on Trump, but certainly doesn't share some of his worldview, or at least the way he expressed it on the campaign as it pertains to immigration. You can look at, for instance, the Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, who was on Jeb Bush's education board, a Common Core, pro-Common Core supporting board. She's earned the ire of places like Breitbart.com. So these are people that certainly didn't adopt his agenda during the campaign, and yet they have been appointed to positions of high power where a lot of loyalists are right now out in the cold. Look at Rudy Giuliani. Look at Chris Christie. These are guys that, took at some great risk to their political careers, decided to back Donald Trump early, and right now they're not seeing much benefit to that.
Jonathan, do these appointments fit with his promise to drain the swamp?
He's actually running the risk, and we're seeing it today. Bernie Sanders came out criticising the NBC, I think it was, reported that the Goldman Sachs president is going to be the director of the National Economic Council. And he's got 4 major donors already in his cabinet. That's more than George W. Bush had in his first cabinet. It's more than President Obama had in his first cabinet. And you're seeing, as Jamie said, you're seeing Breitbart attack some of these folks, because you've got to remember that the nationalist populist base that elected Donald Trump and that Breitbart represents is hardly friendly to Wall Street. So you are going to see some clashes here, and I think politically he's treading into dangerous territory.
Jamie, we mentioned Kathy McMorris Rodgers. Her name has surfaced as perhaps the leading contender to be Interior Secretary. What does she bring to that post?
Well, I think, first of all, again, it's the stagecraft. He's been critiqued that he doesn't have enough diversity in his cabinet by some. So it'll bring another a woman to his cabinet, so I think he might like that image. But to Jonathan's point, though, earlier, the Goldman Sachs people that are just flowing into this administration, it is really contra his own rhetoric, Donald Trump's own rhetoric during the campaign. He used to attack Ted Cruz as a pawn of Goldman Sachs. And now we have a Goldman Sachs person running the Treasury. We just learned that they're bringing in another Goldman Sachs, the COO, into the White House as the head of the Economic Council there. So, we're seeing a lot of surprises that maybe some of his base wouldn't like. But as we learned, Donald Trump can do almost anything, and a lot of his base just shrugs their shoulders because they trust him.
He's full of surprises. Jamie Weinstein and Jonathan Swan. Gentlemen, thanks.
Thank you.
Now, Donald Trump getting ready to assume the presidency some 6 weeks from now. And it is clear he's not shy, no, never shy, about talking things over with people who may not necessarily agree with him. Liberals like former Vice President Al Gore and movie star Leonardo DiCaprio, plus a string of Democratic mayors, other leaders. They've all shown up at the golden elevators of Trump Tower. So let's bring in Howard Kurtz, Fox News media analyst and host of Media Buzz. Thanks for joining us.
Hi there, Heather.
Well, I don't know if you were listening earlier to a segment that John was doing, and his guest actually referred to some of this as stagecraft, as if it's all just kind of smoke and mirrors when Leonardo DiCaprio or Al Gore shows up. So why isn't he getting any credit for this?
Yeah, I've really been struck by the way the press has kind of glossed this over. Oh, isn't that cute? He's meeting with Al Gore. Al Gore, Mr. Inconvenient Truth. The climate change guy comes out of the meeting with the president-elect and says we had a serious and positive discussion, and he's open to finding areas of common ground. Look, he's even talking to Mitt Romney about a possible cabinet job. And Donald Trump is talking to President Obama and told the Today Show that he's taken Obama's advice, at least on some cabinet selection. So that seems to me to be not just stagecraft, but kind of reaching out to the opposition, and yet it goes against the narrative that Donald Trump only sows conflict and likes to beat people up on Twitter. So I don't think he's gotten much credit for it.
Yeah, so what would it take? Is there anything that he could possibly do?
Anything that he could do to change the media narrative?
Yes.
I'm not so sure at this point. Well, look, part of this is because of things that Trump is doing. For example, tweeting about Boeing and the Air Force One contract, tweeting about another company in Indiana that is threatening to move all its jobs to Mexico, and then taking on this local steelworkers official, Chuck Jones, who criticized him first over the Carrier deal. So this is a very different style than we're used to in a president or president-elect. It's much more personal. Trump has always been much more of a street fighter, and the media are just sort of shocked and horrified at the way he does this. Now, it's fine to criticize the Carrier deal or the Air Force One contract on substantive grounds, but I think it's time for the press to get over the fact that this is a guy who is going to have a very different style as president of the United States.
Yeah, get used to the fact I have an idea that he will not quit tweeting. And then the way that he's announcing his nominations, going directly to the people on this thank you tour, that as well, totally different, bypassing the media for that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. What's gotten us much more attention has been Jennifer Palmieri, Hillary Clinton's communications director, first at Harvard and yesterday in an op-ed piece in the Washington Post, again saying, well, Trump won in part because of appeal to white supremacists, and he needs to stop dividing the country. Well, it was a divisive campaign. But, with Trump, it's not like we didn't see this for 18 months. He does have much more of a pugilistic style. Now, will that work in governing as president? We will have to see. But there is a little bit of, in the Beltway press, oh, this is simply not how it's done. It's not presidential, but a lot of it is symbolism, and some of it is about putting pressure on companies to try to get things done.
Yeah, and, he won the election, and all those people that voted for him, they didn't like the way it was done. Thank you so much for joining us, Howie. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Good to see you. You too.
That's senior Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway firing back at Team Clinton after Clinton's former communications director, Jennifer Palmieri, again accused Donald Trump's camp of giving the alt-right movement a platform in the election. Conway says the president-elect has denounced the group, and she says the Clinton camp should recognize the real reason they lost. Voters just didn't connect with their candidate. Joining us now for a little discussion of all of this, Mark Larson, a conservative Southern California radio host. Leslie Marshall, a syndicated radio host and Fox News contributor, is also there with us. Leslie, what do you think about Kellyanne Conway's advice? Should the Clinton camp just stop?
No. Well, if they want to, yes. If they want to, no. Last time I checked, we had a First Amendment right to write in the Washington Post or anywhere else an op-ed and to give the opinion. I do agree that's not the reason that that Hillary Clinton lost. But honestly, I don't think Kellyanne should pay mind to the insults. I get plenty of them online every day.
Well, she says
ignore them and they'll go away and move forward and focus on what needs to be done for this country.
She says she's gotten death threats because of all this.
That's disgusting. I've had death threats, too, from things I've said, and we know that there was a union worker that had death threats from the president-elect's tweet the other day, and that is part of the problem, I think, that Jennifer Palmieri is speaking to, John, which is the continued divisiveness and vitriolic nature of this country right now, and I think it's essential that President-elect Trump stand up and speak to a lot of the hate crimes that are happening and a lot of this division, because he has promised to unite the country. I think we need to see some of that, and I would really like to see Kellyanne speak to that as well.
So, Mark, what do you think about what Jennifer Palmieri and the Clinton camp are saying?
Yeah. I think Jennifer is using a Bic lighter or something to light the torch, and despite what Leslie is saying here, I think her side needs some new material. It's always the isms, the racism. It's the white supremacy now. It's anti-women, anti-this, that, whatever. Words do mean things, and they do have results and consequences. And I'm very concerned with as this heats up. Sure, both sides should take a look and make sure that they're not fanning flames here too. But the Democrats, the left in particular, some of the mainstream media have not learned any lesson from the election. They've not figured out how, when you get into the even though it's free speech, rhetoric that leads to violence in the streets, for example, that's a big concern coming up at the inauguration because activist groups on the left are looking for ways to stir things up too. It's a time to be cautious, but don't blame it all, as they always do, on whoever the conservative or non-Democrat side happens to be.
Leslie, she seems to be blaming, Jennifer Palmieri, seems to be blaming white supremacists for giving this election to Donald Trump. There aren't enough white supremacists in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin to make him the president of the United States, are there?
I would agree with you, John. That is not the reason that Hillary Clinton lost, and I've said that before. There are a number of reasons. I mean, she did not visit Wisconsin. She didn't take her husband, former President Bill Clinton's advice and care about the disenfranchised white working class voter, and I think they are really what gave it to Donald Trump and put him over the top in the Electoral College. Bernie bus people that stayed home, African Americans that stayed home, a division in the Democratic Party. The list goes on. But I do think that a lot of the rhetoric, to Mark's point, I do think a lot of the rhetoric of fanning the flames, it is out there, and some of this rhetoric came from our president-elect, and I think that he has a responsibility and the power to stop it.
All right, well, talking about
a lot of that is old news.
Mark, it sounds like a dodge. If those are, in fact, the reasons that Hillary Clinton lost the election, why not own up to it?
Well, I don't think she's wired that way. Maybe she needs to go back to Chelsea's apartment, which is the finest medical facility in America, I guess, and just get rebooted. Because this idea, it was hers. It happened in 2008. She thought she was entitled. The entitlement class is having heads explode. I guess that's incendiary rhetoric, sorry. The entitlement class is having a hard time figuring this out, that they lost because the issues didn't match a number of Americans who felt disenfranchised. And I think Bernie Sanders probably understands that better than a lot of them because he was disenfranchised by the same Clinton machine.
Yeah, as you point out, Leslie, Bernie Sanders, I guess it was Kellyanne Conway who said that Bernie Sanders supporters were never fully embraced by the Clinton campaign. And then we could get into that basket of deplorables remark.
Yes.
If you say that half of the Donald Trump supporters, which turns out to be a quarter of those who voted in the election, are deplorable, that's not necessarily a way to, win friends and influence people.
I don't disagree, John, but really I just don't see the numbers showing that in the exit polls as the reason to why she lost. I cited earlier, I think, the reasons that she lost, and one of which was the division within the Democratic Party and different ideas as to those who were willing to move more center with Hillary Clinton and those who were sticking with Bernie and staying to the left and really just didn't want to stop the revolution. And many of them stayed home or voted for Gary Johnson or voted for Jill Stein. Those are the numbers. I mean, the numbers don't lie. Those are the numbers, and that's really why she lost.
Flawed. She had baggage.
I don't agree with
she
that.
was a horrible candidate.
She beat him in the popular election by what? Now 2 points.
Yeah, you take California out of that, New York
votes.
out of that. Yeah. So what? The Constitution matters, Leslie. You know that. Come on.
I'm not saying the Constitution doesn't matter,
matters.
but you can't say that this is a completely flawed candidate to get that many votes in the popular vote.
She's a human being. She's mostly flawed. Okay, mostly flawed then. It's a Christmas season. Even you can smile, Leslie. Come on.
We'll leave it at that.
I always smile, and aren't we? And I'll be the first to admit that I and all of us are flawed.
We'll leave it there.
That's right.
On this
Amen to that.
pre-holiday Friday. Mark Larson, Leslie Marshall. Good discussion. Thank you both. President-elect Donald Trump meeting with the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, this morning as we learn new details about the search for a Secretary of State. Hello and happy Friday to you. I'm John Scott.
And I'm Heather Childers in for Jenna Lee. Yes, it's Friday. We made it to the weekend.
We did.
Yeah, nice to be here with you.
Good to have you here,
Well,
Heather.
Speaker Ryan left Trump at the Trump Tower less than an hour ago after what he called an exciting meeting with the president-elect.
Mr. Trump heading to Louisiana later today for a Get Out the Vote rally to support a Republican Senate candidate. He's also continuing his thank you tour with a rally in Grand Rapids, Michigan. David Lee Miller, live outside Trump Tower. He has the latest for us. David Lee.
John, the president-elect's transition team says that so far Mr. Trump has met with 90 individuals who might have a role in a future administration. As best we know, he did not meet with any potential job applicants today, but as you mentioned, he did have a face-to-face with the House Speaker, Paul Ryan. Mr. Ryan entered Trump Tower around 9 o'clock this morning. He did so through a private entrance away from camera crews. Mr. Ryan has said a top priority for the new Congress is going to be the repeal of Obamacare. His spokesperson said the purpose of today's meeting was to discuss their policy agenda. After the meeting was over, Ryan made a brief statement but did not take any questions.
Very exciting meeting. I really enjoyed coming up here, meeting with the president-elect. We had a great meeting to talk about our transition. We're very excited about getting to work and hitting the ground running in 2017 to put this country back on track. Thanks, guys.
As for the president-elect, last night Mr. Trump continued his thank you victory tour, paying a visit to Des Moines, Iowa. He told the crowd that his cabinet nominees are among the most successful in the world. 4 of them are reported to be billionaires. He said that some of them might consider foregoing their salaries in the name of public service. Mr. Trump, at this hour, now on his way to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He will attend a rally there for the Republican Senate candidate who is facing a runoff election. Then it's on to Grand Rapids, Michigan for another thank you rally. The last time Mr. Trump visited Grand Rapids was the night before the general election. He carried the Grand Rapids area by 14 percentage points over Hillary Clinton. John?
All right, David Lee Miller, thank you. So the president-elect is still considering a wide range of names for Secretary of State. It all comes as he made several key cabinet selections this week. Let's talk more about this with Glenn Hall, U.S. News editor for the Wall Street Journal. And you've sort of classified the Secretary of State possibles into umbrella groups. You want to share that with us?
Yeah, sure. You're starting to see, as the pool keeps widening, not narrowing, the different types of candidates emerging. So we see guys like Rex Tillerson and Alan Mulally who've been coming through Trump Tower. That's sort of the corporate class of candidates.
CEO of Exxon and CEO of Ford.
Yes.
Right. Used to be
Boeing. That's right. And then you've got like these sort of military opportunities. So you see several generals in the mix there, Petraeus among them, for example, General Petraeus. And then you see the sort of political elite. You've got Senator Bob Corker, and you've got Mitt Romney still in the game, right? And then you've got folks that are sort of close to or people that Trump likes. There again, you see Petraeus in the mix, and you also see Rudy Giuliani still in the game. But many of those people you see sort of rising and falling stock in terms of their appearances and what they're saying publicly.
People like Newt Gingrich have criticized Mr. Trump, said don't make it so public, don't parade all these people through and kind of leave them all hanging, make it a more private process, and then make your selection from there. What do you think about that criticism?
Well, I think part of what you see Donald Trump doing is, floating those trial balloons, getting public feedback and getting media feedback, getting the vetting done by all of us who look into each and every one of these candidates. That may be serving him well in terms of helping him to make his final decision. So if you did that all behind closed doors, he might not have the benefit of that kind of feedback. And he does seem to crave that feedback.
He also has been criticized for putting a number of generals forward to be his cabinet members and also his national security advisor, not a cabinet level position. does that hurt General Petraeus in the hunt for Secretary of State?
Some have suggested that that could be a problem. You already have, as you point out, several generals who've moved in. You've also seen criticism elsewhere where talking about the number of billionaires and millionaires in the cabinet, but that hasn't prevented Donald Trump from looking to those people who he trusts, who he thinks have the experience to be on the cabinet. So I'm not sure it's 100% ruled out.
Well, and he answered that. He said, look, I want tough negotiators for my cabinet. I want people who have proven that they know how to get things done.
That is exactly the answer to, those who say, oh, too many of this kind or this kind of candidate. He's going to the pool of people he knows and trusts. He's looking for people with experience and track records. But also, I think you see in this cabinet, a mix of a lot of outsiders that haven't been in politics and some of those people who know how to work within the system to get things done. And that seems to also be one of the criteria. But there's definitely kind of a yin and yang of types of people in the cabinet as it emerges.
And we have to remember, as these people parade through the lobby of Trump Tower, he's not just looking to fill the #1 position. He's also looking to fill the #2 positions in many of these agencies.
That's a very good point. We see folks that are being analyzed for also other executive level posts that are the deputy to many of these cabinet level posts. But he's also still got to fill things like, the FEC, the SEC, all of these other kinds of agencies need heads. So we're never entirely sure who's being interviewed for what. And what we hear is, these are kind of, apprentice style interviews where he's really trying to figure out, I have a problem, how would you solve it? And then he's, talking to a wide variety of people, trying to find who's got the best ideas.
It's fascinating to think back a month, a little more than that, and everybody was predicting that the Republican Party would be in absolute tatters after the election, that the Democrats would be having this love-in with a President-elect Hillary Clinton. And in fact, it's just the opposite. You've got, Paul Ryan and Donald Trump practically buddy-buddy, or so it would seem from what Mr. Ryan just had to say. And the Democrats are kind of, in a circular firing squad.
Yeah, you definitely see an exact opposite of what some were predicting just a few months ago. And within the Republicans, they've been waiting a long time, John, to get the White House. They also have the White House, the Senate, and the House. So there's a lot of expectation that you need to be able to get things done. So I think that explains in large measure how everybody's trying to come together to figure out what can we all agree on to get done so that by the time the midterms come, they look good rather than look like they have failed to take advantage of that control that they have.
But Democrats, especially Senate Democrats, to be led by Chuck Schumer, are suggesting that they're going to put the brakes on any nominees or a lot of the nominees that Donald Trump is putting forward. What do you think about the politics of that?
This is always a challenge, and we've seen so much of that sort of very partisan bickering going on and preventing things from getting done. I think the mandate that everybody has right now in Congress and Donald Trump himself is to get things done. This was an election that was against gridlock in Washington in many respects. And so I think, when you see Senator Schumer and others taking that sort of opposition approach, they're going to fall into the very trap the Republicans were in as the no party for a long time. And I think people are looking for action.
All right. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the first 100 days and beyond. Glenn Hall, Wall Street Journal. Glenn, thank you.
Godspeed, John Glenn. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Captain is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
Well, today, all of America is saying Godspeed, John Glenn. The hero and space pioneer died yesterday afternoon, surrounded by his family at the age of 95. And my next guest, fellow astronaut Tom Jones, says that Glenn was a role model growing up, inspired him to actually make his own journey into space. Tom Jones is a former NASA astronaut and author of the book Ask the Astronaut, a galaxy of astonishing answers to your questions on spaceflight. And he's logged more than, 53 days in space, over 4 space flights as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Heather.
So I was reading some of what you had to say yesterday and today, and you were recalling that you were 7 years old when John Glenn launched into space. You were in class at the time. What do you remember about that day?
Well, that day, that event, John Glenn being the first American to orbit the Earth, was so important to our national psyche. It really took us from being well behind the Soviet Union in the space race and thrust us right back into the competition. And so Everything stopped that day. Some parent brought a television into our classroom. We stopped everything to listen to the countdown and the blast off, and then tracked his mission over the next 5 hours. And then he came back to a hero's welcome, and America had changed. We were on our way to the moon.
Yeah, you know what? 3 orbits in 5 hours. It was dangerous, uncharted territory. In fact, he had actually witnessed an unmanned test rocket explode and then another tumble into the ocean before he ever even took off. Have we lost that pioneering spirit, and how do we get it back?
Now, Glenn went into those flights with his eyes wide open. He knew the dangers involved, and he stepped up to the challenge that the nation faced and he faced personally to succeed in space. And I don't think we've lost that spirit. I think many of the colleagues I have at NASA today are eager to keep pioneering and to keep pressing forward, putting humans on the very edge of scientific exploration. And it's just a matter of leadership and a clear goal and the resources to achieve that. And we'll be right back in that kind of leadership position once again.
Yeah. Is he why you became an astronaut?
He and the Mercury 7 astronauts were the heroes of my youth, along with a few strategic Orioles baseball players. And I had a book about them called Americans into Orbit, and that's the thing that clinched me trying to choose a career in space, aviation, and exploration.
Yeah. Unreal that 36 years after that initial flight, he went up again and again, made history, becoming the oldest man in space. Do you think that he should have done that? And when he came back, he actually had a meeting with some astronauts, and you were part of that meeting. What did he say?
Sure. Senator Glenn was finishing up his career in the Senate. He came to fly on the Space Shuttle Discovery, came down to Houston for training, and he essentially moved into the astronaut office. And he had a meeting with us astronauts there, and he said, I'm not Senator Glenn, I'm John. I'm a test pilot, I'm an astronaut. I'm going to be working with you to learn what I need to know to do a successful job on this mission. He was just the most approachable, down-to-earth man that you'd ever want to work with.
And he signed that book for you that you had had as a youth, right? Americans
I had my
Orbit?
hero worship face on, and I was clutching that book, and he was nice enough to sign it for me.
Well, something else that you wrote about, you actually compared the status of where he launched from Cape Canaveral and the status of that today with the space program today, both of them being in disarray.
Well, if you go to Complex 14 down at Cape Canaveral, there's little left of the metal of the launch pad. The gantries are all gone. The concrete's still there. The blockhouse is there. And nicely, there are even 7 parking spaces for the original Mercury astronauts with their names on them. But it's in mothballs. And in many ways, our space program for the last 8 years has been in mothballs. We're hitching rides with the Russians to the space station. We need to re-energize that, get Americans flying from Cape Canaveral again, and then we need to send them quickly out to the moon, to a nearby asteroid, and eventually to Mars.
All right, Dr. Tom Jones sharing with us some very personal memories today. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
To the unknown cosmos.
Florida Senator Bill Nelson, also a former astronaut, announcing the death of John Glenn on the Senate floor, paying tribute to a true American hero. Senator Nelson joins me now live. So ironic, he was the first to orbit the Earth, and he is the last of the Mercury 7 to go. Tell us your thoughts this morning.
John blazed the trail for the rest of us. It was so dicey at that point, that Atlas rocket, and we were trying to catch up with the Soviets because they had already gone into orbit, first with Gagarin and then with Titov. That Atlas, we knew it had a 20% chance of failure. And so he truly blazed the trail for everybody else.
And it took, as you point out, a tremendous amount of courage to get on board what was a pretty shaky, collection of metal and oxygen and hydrogen and say, yeah, go ahead and hit the launch button.
That's right. John used to joke about it. He said, well, this rocket was built by the lowest bidder. But the truth was, other than sending a chimpanzee up, we didn't know what was going to happen to the human body. And then once John got up for a planned 7 orbits, then they had an indication that the heat shield was loose. They decided to bring him back after 3 orbits and hoping that it was going to hold up. And on re-entry, right before the blackout period, through the fiery heat of re-entry, they could hear John humming the battle hymn of the Republic.
Yeah. It is. I mean, he was one of the iconic heroes of my childhood, just because, you know, the Soviet Union was ahead of us in the space race, or so it seemed, and those Mercury 7 really caught up to and helped the whole nation lift its national mood after those early Soviet Sputnik and manned launches.
Absolutely. Remember, the Soviets had surprised us. They put up Sputnik first. They held the high ground. Then they got into space before we did. But look who got to the moon almost 50 years ago. And now we're going to Mars, John. And those rockets that are the forerunner to the Mars program will launch in 2 years, the largest rocket ever, and Americans will be on commercial space rockets within 2 years, going to and from the International Space Station. So we're right on the cusp of this brand new adventure, and ultimately that is to take a human crew to the planet Mars by the year 2033.
I was in Ohio last month for the elections and flew home from the John Glenn Airport. Talk briefly about his contributions as a senator.
Well, of course, he's this icon that senators could disagree with him, but they also had a sense of awe about this American hero. And that's what his entire public life was. And the interesting thing about John is he was always so humble.
Yeah.
All this adulation, and yet it was just like in your previous piece, he went down to fly at age 77 and finally see the Earth, since he hadn't had a chance on his 3 orbits. And this time he says, "Don't call me Senator, call me John."
I was there when they launched him into space on the shuttle at age 77. What a guy. Senator Bill Nelson.
What a guy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Be right back.
Thanks, John.
Malicious fake news and false propaganda that flooded social media over the past year. It's now clear that so-called fake news can have real-world consequences. This isn't about politics or partisanship. Lives are at risk. Lives of ordinary people just trying to go about their days, to do their jobs, contribute to their communities. It's a danger that must be addressed.
That's Hillary Clinton asking Congress to take action against fake news. The former presidential candidate did not discuss the election results directly, but made it clear she thinks made-up stories on social media are becoming a problem. Let's bring in Judith Miller, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and investigative reporter. Also, Ellen Ratner, the bureau chief for Talk Radio News, both of them Fox News contributors. Judy, there are situations in which fake news has caused real chaos in this country.
Right. Well, we've seen the example, and it's just the one that's been most publicized, of the shootout in the pizza parlor based on a story that was totally made up about Democratic leaders, including Hillary Clinton, running a pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor. And some demented, idiotic person went in with a gun and shot up the place. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. But as Meredith Broussard of the NYU, she studies fake news, told me when we were talking about this, this is just one of a number of incidents. So, yes, fake news has real consequences, and we've got to deal with it. And the platforms, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Yahoos, the people who promote this, who put it up for clicks, have to take some responsibility for this. This is very, very serious, not just in terms of our security and our safety, but actually fake news can help undermine our democracy.
But Ellen, isn't that genie already out of the bottle? I mean, when anybody in any country can click send and put anything out there for the whole world to see, how do you stop that?
Well, first of all, it is a huge problem. I agree with Judy Miller. She won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting. If you have fake news, what do you do about things like that? I mean, somebody like Judy Miller would be in real trouble with these crazy fake news people. On the other hand, if Congress does take a look at it, then you've got a problem, because we do have freedom of speech in this country.
Yeah.
You know, so that's a big problem. I don't know how Congress is going to have to do with it, but I agree with Judy Miller. We've got to get people like the various websites that are managed through corporations to begin to take a look at it and take these posts down.
Well, people like Mark Zuckerberg, Judy, the head of Facebook, has said he doesn't think fake news is a problem.
Right. Well, he said it wasn't a problem until he discovered that it was a problem. He has met with conservatives who have protested the algorithms that Facebook uses that actually discriminated against conservative-themed stories. But the whole point is these platforms must take responsibility. I agree with Ellen. I don't want the government initially involved in these decisions. These are decisions of media organizations, whether or not they consider themselves that, rather than just groups that sell ads. But they've got to assume some responsibility and some liability if things go wrong for what appears on their sites. And I think that's where this campaign has to start. Zuckerberg has already met with his conservative critics. A lot more of that has to go on. But what we need is transparency for how Facebook and the other social media platforms make their decisions. We don't have any of that now. We don't know it. And yet, 60% of Americans got some or all of their political news during the campaign from Facebook. There were 1 billion people, there were 1 billion tweets put up during the campaign, and 128 million people went to Facebook to discuss the campaign. So we can't pretend anymore that these are just kind of neutral platforms that have no responsibility for what's up there.
A lot of these fake news stories, Ellen, are generated in places like Macedonia or Eastern Europe, generally by people, you know, teenagers even, who have, you know, strong computer skills and can make money by putting stories out there that are sensationalist enough that people will click on them. So, again, how do you stop that? How do you tell Americans?
Well, I think you need real journalists, people who win Pulitzer Prizes like Judy Miller, to go after these people and to actually track them down and see who's doing this and put that in real news. And that's how I think you have to deal with it. And you have to get Mark Zuckerberg, you have to get the Twitter people who run those accounts to be accountable to people.
And, you know, I guess visit the reputable sites, like, for instance, foxnews.com. It's a discussion we're going to have many times in the future, I'm afraid. Ellen Ratner, Judy Miller, thank you both.
Thank you.